Thank you all for being here this afternoon. My name is Skip Rutherford, the Dean of the Clinton School of Public Service, and we welcome you today as we talk about a very interesting and newsworthy topic in our state. If you've been following the developments, including those on the wire today, you realize the interest in this issue. Speaking of international, I might add to tell you that this is where our students are going this summer as they do their international public service projects throughout the world. They'll be on all 6 inhabited continents, and about half of them have already left. And as we have dealt with the complicated issues, Paul, of visas and travel, I understand the challenges that this issue creates. Would you please, may I ask you to please, good to see you, ma'am. Glad to see you here, Wendell. I wrote you a note. I'm glad to see you. It's Wendell Griffin. I ask everybody to please turn their cell phones and Blackberries and other electronic devices off. Mr. Harrelson, Under the Dome. Are you blogging us? Good. If you hadn't read Under the Dome blog, you need to bookmark it. That's Representative Steve Harrelson's blog, and I read it about 2 or 3 times a day because he's a prolific blogger. Today's program, ladies and gentlemen, Jim Miranda is a founding member of the Arkansas Friendship Coalition. That's an organization of civic and business leaders who believe immigration is a federal issue and advocate against sweeping anti-immigration laws at the local level in Arkansas. In spirit of full disclosure, I'm a member of that group. A resident of Bella Vista, Jim is an outspoken advocate for the rights of immigrants in Northwest Arkansas. He fought against the creation of an illegal immigration criminal apprehension task force and works closely with the ACLU and the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. He was honored for his humanitarian efforts by the just communities of Northwest Arkansas. If you've read the stories in the media about this topic, particularly in Washington and Benton counties, and some have been quite controversial, you can't read an article without the name Jim Miranda appearing, because he knows the subject and he's involved in the subject. Would you welcome Jim Miranda?
Hello, everybody. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. I'd like to thank the Dean for inviting me to be here. I feel very, very honored to be here with the Clinton School. I feel like I'm in distinguished company. So thank you very much, and those of you that I recognize out in the audience, hello to you, and thank you for taking the time, every one of you, to come and hear about this very serious subject. This is one man's perspective on this issue of undocumented immigration. As I prepared for the meeting, I thought long and hard about what aspects of this immigration issue would I cover. This certainly covers a lot of ground. Would I cover the civil liberty aspects, the current climate in Arkansas for immigrants, immigration in general, or possibly even the fallout of these raids that we have seen unfolding in certain parts of Arkansas? Certainly, there are a lot of issues that we're faced with now with this issue of undocumented immigration. It's my goal that in the short time that we have together, that you come away with a better understanding of this complex issue and how this affects very real, living human beings, just like you and I. Because make no mistake, this is a human rights issue. This is an issue that touches each and every one of us, regardless of where you find yourself on the political landscape. So, needless to say, there's so much to cover. I'm just going to kind of take a bird's eye view of the situation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, like I said, the human aspects of it, the philosophical aspects of it. But first I want to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Jim Miranda, and I'm a businessman who works for an international, multi-billion-dollar corporation. And no, it's not Walmart. Actually, not working for Walmart has actually loaned me the ability to be a little bit more outspoken than some of my comrades who email me that work there at Walmart and say, "Way to go, Jim, I wish I could be out there with you, but I can't." But such are the constraints that we often impose upon ourselves. But what does this have to do with immigration, the fact that I work for this large corporation? Nothing really. My corporation I'm involved in the chemical business, a highly technical field. We don't employ a lot of immigrants. But what is important and what is relevant is that I am the son of an immigrant. That is very much relevant to this debate. I consider this an interesting descriptor. However, it's not one that I've been accustomed to using over the years. I've never really considered myself the son of an immigrant. I was raised by a father who felt very, very much American. And he didn't waste one moment of his time making it clear to his sons and daughters, I being one of his sons, telling us that, "Son, do not forget you are American. I sacrificed to come to this country. I made a home for us here, and I made a place for you, and rest assured that you are American." My father was a little bit irritated by words like Chicano, statements like "Viva la raza," and those kinds of descriptors like Mexican-American. He took some offense at those things. I'm not sure that I would agree with him entirely. Mr. Senor Miranda was opinionated himself, but I certainly can understand his position, and suffice it to say that he was, in fact, a very proud American. So I approach this issue, and this very complex issue, with all the complexity of my own upbringing. So rest assured that today, even though you see what may look like an obvious Hispanic Latino gentleman standing before you, consider that it's simply the color of my skin. That's what you're looking at. But standing before you is an American. And that's how I want to approach this issue today. I work with several organizations. Some of them were mentioned here. I'm a founding member of the Arkansas Friendship Coalition. And greetings to some of my colleagues here in the crowd. Paul, it's good to see you. Graham, Holly, hello. And some other of you that I haven't seen. But I also work with MALDEF, which is a national organization, kind of the legal arm of LULAC. I work also with some national organizations like NCLR and work on special projects. Right now I'm working on one with the Urban Institute. And so you can say that I've dove in with 2 feet into this issue. And why? Why was I so compelled to come out of hiding, as I like to say, in my little town of Bella Vista? That's where I'm from. I think the newspapers have made it very clear that I'm Jim Miranda from Bella Vista. Northwest Arkansas doesn't let me forget that I live there. Oftentimes they'll tell me, Jim, why don't you go on back there? I'm here to stay. I love it here. But I'd like to say that I was always a socially conscious individual, but the truth is that that's going to be a little bit of a stretch if I would say that. Certainly I've long had an interest in politics, but I must admit that prior to moving to Arkansas, this issue of immigration was simply a peripheral issue to me. I like to say that this issue chose me. I, like every one of you who will ultimately draw your conclusions regarding this issue, I made my decision because of my deep love for my country and for other very compelling reasons. Reasons like my own family. I remember the Saturday when it happened for me. I was in my kitchen. I was having a cup of coffee. I was looking out over the beautiful lake view there. I live on one of the lakes in Bella Vista. And as I was reading the newspaper, my heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks. It felt like somebody had punched me in the stomach. I had been following the Hazleton, Pennsylvania ordinance, and if those of you who are not familiar with that ordinance, It was an ordinance promoted by the mayor of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, that would impose very steep fines on landlords who would rent to undocumented immigrants and employers who would hire undocumented immigrants. It also imposed steep fines. And then there was also an initiative, an English-only initiative in that measure. And what I was reading before me, began to read it in slow motion. It's that one moment when your world seems to stop and as you start to encounter something so very disturbing. And you might ask me, why did that article disturb you so much? Because as I read that article, I read that a mayor of a local city that was very nearby, a city that I often frequented, worked in, and was part of the quality of life that I enjoyed in Northwest Arkansas. The mayor of that city was proposing an ordinance very similar to the one in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Now, on the surface, when you take a look at that, and a lot of individuals have opinions about such things, and when you look at it on the surface, someone might say, you know what, it's not a bad idea. What's wrong with that? Why shouldn't these employers be fined? Aren't they the root cause of the situation? And these landlords that are promoting these folks coming in droves and living in groups in a small two-bedroom house, shouldn't they be fined? Isn't that the right thing to do? Well, if you look at the world like that, I suppose it would be a good way to approach a situation. But the issue of immigration is far more complex. And you have to look deeply into a matter to understand. And perhaps you might have even had to have been a minority who have experienced the realities of an America that, while being a beautiful place, and certainly a place full of promise and opportunity, there are also realities and constraints that we as minorities are faced with. And that's how I approached that issue. When I read that newspaper, I pictured my daughters. I have two lovely daughters and a lovely wife. I have one daughter, my oldest daughter. She looks kind of like Mom. Mom is a beautiful lady of Norwegian descent, certainly not Hispanic, doesn't look Hispanic in any way. And my daughter, my oldest daughter, kind of looks like Mom. Takes a lot after her. And my other daughter happens to have been blessed with Dad's pigmentation, his olive-colored complexion, dark eyes and dark curly hair, certainly a lovely little Latin beauty that will certainly steal the hearts of many a gentleman when she comes of age, and that's way down the road. But I pictured my two lovely daughters and how they would be impacted by such an ordinance. And I pictured them, college age, going to a landlord at an apartment complex, and those exciting times and all of that entails. Many of you, I'm sure, have experienced that, your children's first place on their own and all the buzz of excitement that goes along with that. And I pictured my daughter Mercedes walking into an apartment complex, the girl who looks like her mother, and she hands in her application, and everybody she's met with and greeted with smiles, and everybody's so happy, and yes, we have a spot for you. And my daughter, Alexis, that looks kind of like Dad, walks into the same apartment complex. But instead of being greeted with those smiles and, yes, we're so happy to have you, she's greeted with a look of suspicion. Because she kind of looks like one of those that may be in question. Now, it isn't because that landlord is racist or xenophobic. In fact, he's probably a good man and she's probably a good woman, has all the best intentions. And because they have all the best intentions, they want to comply with every aspect of the law. And they want to make sure that they don't skirt the law in any which way, shape, form, or fashion. So what do? They default to the side of caution, as we so often do. And so because they're good people, they don't want to get in trouble. So that person who looks questionable, that may cause them to pay steep fines and cause them to lose their family business, they decide we can't risk it. It's too much hassle. There's too many errors on those verification systems anyways that have been put in place. So my daughter is now disenfranchised. That's why I was sucker punched that Saturday morning. And that is why it hit me very, very deep. It was a very personal cost. Now, it was only later that I really dove into this issue with both feet and started getting involved in the community and seeing the ramifications of the proposals that began to ensue that I began to see the larger implications in this debate. It went beyond the Miranda family household and began to stretch into the community at large. I began to see how my brothers and sisters that I love and admired, people that I considered friends and chatted with, how they were treating some of those people that were part of my own family and my people. And I began to see the impacts for them, and the anecdotes started to roll in. One of the things that really irritated me about this situation, and it really was the motivator for having me get involved with this issue, is that the mayor, which was the one promoting these anti-immigrant initiatives in the city of Rogers, made a statement to the press in which he said that he was not going to be painted into corners by offering statistics and evidences and such. He had anecdotal evidence to suggest that a disproportionate percentage of undocumented immigrants were solely responsible for the crime in Northwest Arkansas. But again, he said, I'm not going to offer up statistics and such. Well, after FOIing the mayor, I discovered why he didn't want to offer up statistics and such. Because that anecdotal evidence that he had was in fact quite anecdotal, and it was not rooted in the facts, nor did the statistics bear out whatsoever that any percentage of the Hispanic population, any community represented in that setting, was responsible for a disproportionate percentage of crime in Northwest Arkansas. Needless to say, that hit the press in a very big way. I had attempted to speak to this gentleman in private and have those conversations that I've often had behind the scenes that have been very effective. I was rebuffed time and time again, so I was compelled to take my findings public, and that's precisely the argument we began to have. It was a very, very public argument. And it wasn't until later that this gentleman agreed to meet with me, and we had a great conversation. We sat down and he heard everything I had to say. He listened to me, perfect gentleman. I told him what my concerns were, told him about my daughters, told him about the problem with ballot initiatives like that, or ordinances rather like that. You would pit contractor against competitor, and you would create a climate of suspicion where everybody was suspect. And he looked across his desk at me and he said, you know what, I agree with a lot of what you have to say, but, I knew there was a but coming. And the but was, but there is that thing called collateral damage. And there again, that hit me like a ton of bricks. He was telling me in no uncertain terms that my interests, that my Americanism, that my rights under the Constitution of the United States, under the civil rights laws that have been enacted throughout this country, were less important to him than his own personal motivations, or maybe the motivations of those who were pushing him in that direction to affect this issue of undocumented immigration. So that's what happened that day. Now, I didn't come here to impugn the good citizens of Arkansas or demonize that community that I call home. There's no doubt that some of that community has grown weary of the so-called minority activists that seem to come out of the woodwork to defend the rights of those who some perceive should not be defended. But I want to be clear. As long as Arkansas officials continue to dehumanize a voiceless minority, these activists will play an important role in allowing us not to forget that Arkansas has been a place where one not only knew one's neighbor, but actually liked one's neighbor. I ask those who even now promote their so-called Secure Arkansas initiative, that is not only duplicitous, expensive, and some might even characterize it as mean-spirited in nature, that have you considered the net result of what you seek? Are not undocumented immigrants already for the most part barred from state and federally funded benefits such as SSI, welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, S-CHIP? It's true that federal law dictates that immigrants, regardless of status, cannot be prohibited from education, prenatal care, school lunch program, etc. Is that our intent? Is that what we want to do? Is create more ignorance in the world? Is create a permanent social underclass? Relegate these individuals to a status where they cannot possibly achieve what America has always promised the immigrant that he can achieve? I remember a certain phrase that's emboldened on a certain statue on a certain harbor, and that has yet to be erased. Are U.S. citizens, children, perhaps, the intended target? Because rest assured, many of these immigrants have United States citizen children. Those are United States citizens like every one of us, or maybe a majority of us, or some of us here in this room. They are United States citizens, granted the same rights that each and every one of us are granted here. Do we want to disenfranchise these children? I ask you today, because this is a very salient question, what are we going to do 15 to 20 years from now? It's estimated that there are about 5 million children born to immigrants in the United States, and roughly 2/3 of those are United States citizens. What are we going to say to those children who we disenfranchised in the ugliest of ways? We ripped them, some of them from their mother's breasts. Some of them, we ripped them from their homes in the middle of the night with guns pointed at them and their parents. We did the ugliest thing to them in destroying their family, taking them out of the country, the only country that they ever knew, their own country, and depositing them in by force in another country that was completely foreign to them. Or worse yet, they landed in a jail system, held like prisoners for something that was no fault of their own. What are we going to tell those children when they come back 15 to 20 years from now? We cannot be so short-sighted as to assume that we're not going to answer those tough questions, because those tough questions are going to face us at some point or another. We can answer them today, before we did that to a whole generation of children, or we can answer them tomorrow after we've done so. And when they look us in the eye and they ask us that very difficult question as of why did you treat a mother and her children so callously as to ignore the pleas? What are we going to say then? Needless to say, they're going to go on these Oprah shows, and we're going to talk about this for days. And beware that political party. Beware that political party who ignored the pleas of these children. It's going to have very, very lasting implications. Today, we can affect that outcome in a positive way. We can do things differently. We don't have to give heed to those kinds of initiatives that we're seeing right now that creates horrific oversight systems. What do those oversight systems even look like? How far do you have to go? Do you create an American-style Gestapo? Is that far enough? I venture to say those people, I'm not saying that those people behind this particular ballot, Secure Arkansas, are racist. I'm not saying that they have ulterior motives, but certainly there are those individuals who are promoting this initiative, who may even be gathering signatures for this initiative, that belong to separatist movements or have ties to racist groups. And can you truly ever satisfy an individual who just likes to hang out with their own kind? How far do you have to go to satisfy that individual? Do you have to turn this country into a third world country? Our economic advantage is 4 to 5 that of Mexico, about $40,000 per capita, 10,000 and 8,000 in El Salvador. How miserable do we have to make ourselves? Do we have to keep people from walking down the sidewalks? Should we tattoo them on the forehead? Well, how far are we willing to go for this? We have to ask ourselves some very, very serious questions. And those people that are behind that initiative should ask themselves this question: what kind of company am I keeping? Are you, in fact, in gross company? Some would say so. Very interestingly, I did a television interview. It was a television special for an international news agency. And ironically, I and the head of the Ku Klux Klan in a local area where I live agreed on something. He said almost the exact same thing I said. Imagine that. Two folks on opposite ends of the spectrum, But we both agreed that this issue of undocumented immigration has been a pretext for those who espouse notions like his to promote their flawed agendas. He agreed that this had given their organizations a new lease on life and a new sense of legitimacy that they have long been craving. That's exactly what I said at a different time, and he said the exact same thing. So that is the company that we're keeping with some of these types of initiatives. And we got to think long and hard because they're expensive, and they have the potential to affect the quality of life for not only that intended target, but those unintended targets. So we have to be careful how we approach that. While some would be quick to dismiss the cultural implications of this debate, I want to say it very clearly that I do understand there are, in fact, cultural implications to this issue and very real concerns. We've grown accustomed to a certain way of life here in Arkansas, and we've developed patterns in our minds of what neighbors should look like and those kinds of things. And when changes start to occur in those settings, they can be a source of consternation to some, and understandably so. I don't fault a human being for feeling uncomfortable if they walk into a Walmart and they see a sea of faces that they're not accustomed seeing and hear languages that they're unaccustomed to hearing. Perhaps they can assume certain things. So I understand those cultural implications. But we can educate ourselves so that we develop an understanding of what those implications actually are. Are they really as deep as we really think? Are those immigrants really so different as having different hopes and dreams and different fears than we do? The reason they come here to this country in the first place, I submit, is because exactly those hopes and dreams that mirror our own hopes and dreams. They see a country that is prosperous. They see an economy that's thriving, especially in comparison to their own. They see a culture to be emulated. And say they don't come here to form their own little separate communities. They come here, by and large, to assimilate into this dominant culture. One has to look no further than what the statistics bear out. There's a lot that say, well, these folks don't want to assimilate, simply because they drive down a neighborhood that business people like myself, business people like you, cater to because of the economic profits that are associated with all types of people. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And it's understandable, again, to see that folks could be uncomfortable, but if we educate ourselves and we learn about these people, we will understand that those neighbors are very much like ourselves, and they are, in fact, learning English at very rapid paces, and by the third generation, they've lost really the full command of their own original language. You can ask my friends that are here from the Mexican consulate how often I speak to them in that garbled Spanish language that they're also patient with me about, and I'm just second generation. So I can assure you that we are assimilating at a very, very quick pace. So there's no cause to be that alarmed. We can educate ourselves and understand what the true impacts are. Now, one of the things you hear a lot about in this issue, in this debate, is about the importance of the rule of law. If I heard that once, I must have heard it 1,000 times. But it's about the rule of law. What are we going to say to our children, and what are we saying to those people? The rule of law is so important. And I'm going to be the first to state that the rule of law is, in fact, very, very critical and very important. But I also ask a pertinent question. What is the rule of law without a guiding sense of decency that it's founded on? Let's think about this for a minute. What's the rule of law in a country, let's say, like China? A country, let's say, like Saudi Arabia? Darfur, maybe. I wonder what the Tibetans have to say about the rule of law in China right about now. You can have rules of law, but if they are not founded on deeper precepts, they become simply points of oppression. Our founders, when they created this great experiment, this great American experiment, they understood that the rule of law was not only important, but they also held certain truths that were self-evident to them, that all men were created equal, endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They considered these to be fundamental to the rule of law, so much that they were willing to disband their common bonds with their countrymen and create a new society, a society that was founded on more noble principles. Aside from the so much invoked rule of law, we also hear phrases like, illegal is illegal. Now, who's going to argue with that phrase, right? Well, yeah, of course, illegal is illegal. Nobody's going to argue with a phrase like that. Certainly, illegal is illegal. But what does this mean? I'll tell you, for the most part, it's meant to end discussion and not foster dialogue. That statement means nothing outside of just kind of a catchy little soundbite. The truth is that if we're going to understand this complex issue, we're going to have to get beyond just that simple rhetoric and start answering the tough questions. The first question, again, is, what is the foundation of the rule of law, if not the altruistic notion of decency and civility? Now, one will also have to consider that there is, in fact, a criminal statute against the stealing of bubble gum, stealing a loaf of bread. There is, in fact, a criminal statute against that. As far as undocumented immigrants are concerned, these people we call illegal aliens, there is no criminal statute against overstaying a visa or not possessing one. This is a civil offense. Now, have we ever had a child who stole a piece of bubble gum? I remember the time when I had to walk back into the store with my young daughter in tow, and she had taken something that she shouldn't have taken, and we had to teach her a very valuable lesson. Now, the last thing that I've done is relegate that child to a permanent status of illegal. I don't call her illegal. I don't tell her she's an illegal. I don't use that terminology. It's a simple offense, and we dealt with it. But yet, people utilize those kinds of statements in terms like anchor babies to dehumanize human beings. It allows them to put a blanket, so to speak, over that face, and they don't have to see a real, living, breathing human being. They get to look at an it. It's far easier to mistreat an it than it is to mistreat your neighbor. It's far easier to mistreat someone that you don't know or don't have anything in common with, somebody that you psychologically closed yourself off to, than to mistreat somebody that you consider a friend and a neighbor. It's far more difficult than that. And we have to consider that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Section 287G and how that plays into that. Many of you have heard terms like 287G floated around. It is in fact a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that allows certain local law enforcement agencies to join in concert with immigration and customs enforcement officials to act as immigration officers. They go to an extensive, I say that facetiously, 3-week training in which now they're ICE experts. And they come out of these trainings, and now they get to run around, and instead of a green suit, they get to keep their police uniforms, but they get to do things that are very, very troubling, things that all of us here find very troubling, such as, without a warrant, inquire as to one's right to be in this country. I don't know about you, but I find that very troubling. The last thing I want to do is walk down the street and all of a sudden a police officer pull me aside and say, what right do you have to be in this country? I venture to say that most of us would be very troubled, but I also venture to say that most of you are the right color. You don't have to worry about things like that. But my community, my brown brothers and sisters, we do have to worry about things like that. We have to worry about things like that when we decide to carpool in a van on our way to a ball game. We can't go see the Naturals anymore in Springdale all together, sitting there having a good time, because God forbid we may be characterized as transporting aliens. We do have to worry about that, and I find that very troubling, that Arkansas has agreed that this is okay for their community, that they're okay with creating a community in which a mother on her way back in the wee morning hours, 2, 3 in the morning, can be stopped because of a taillight being out, and the next thing you know, she's facing deportation proceedings or threatened with them. That particular mother is a very real person. She happened to be a permanent legal resident. She had every right to be there in the morning. And she almost would have said, "Thank you for letting me know my taillight was out," if the next set of circumstances wouldn't have ensued. But instead, what happened? The passenger, which the police officer had no right to ask, but he did, he saw that brown skin that seems to be at the root of all this problem. And he said, "Where's your identification? Let me see your ID." And next thing you know, he's on the ground, seated on the curb, and that sick baby with 103 fever is waiting there while these police interrogate and threaten and harass those parents. This mother was threatened to have, the officer said, "We're knowing full well he couldn't do this, but he did it to harass her anyways because he could." And there are those among us that do those kinds of things. And that is why we have to say no to bad ideas like this. Decent people wouldn't use these mechanisms to antagonize and harass. But there are those people that are not so decent. And we have to protect ourselves against their philosophies as well. This person was threatened that her status was going to be revoked. And they were going to take away her permanent status because she was in the car with somebody who was an undocumented immigrant. And what of that baby? What happens to him? That's one story. How would you like to move into this new house? You moved into this new house, you're happy, and the door, you hear a knock on the door, and all of a sudden you see a team of agents there. Police officers, people with strange lettering, but you know nonetheless that they're law enforcement. And they ask you, "Where is so-and-so?" And you say, "They don't live here. They've moved away. We moved in after them. We're the new tenants in this home." Well, that would have ended the conversation for most of us. At that point, that would have been the end of discussion. But not if you're not the right color. Because these people were faced with the next set of questions were, "Well, by the way, since we're here, we'd like to come in and have a look around." Well, why? What's wrong? What's going on? What do we do? Well, nothing, but if you don't have anything to hide, why won't you let us in? I mean, you're hiding something, or you would let us in right now. Next thing you know, the door's open, they walk in the door, and 5 to 8 people are facing deportation proceedings. Is that the America we intended when we signed on 287G? Or how about the Acambaro raids in northwest Arkansas? Those raids that this new task force, this illegal immigrant criminal apprehension task force, they promised us to go after the various very, very serious crimes of methamphetamine trafficking. After all, Jim, don't you know that they are literally coming in droves from Mexico? I mean, we pull more of these drug dealers over than you could ever imagine. Strangely, the statistics were absent, but that's what they said anyways. This is going to be for serious crimes. And their first major raid was to go after those serious criminals who bring the food to your table when you go out to the restaurant. That busboy who walks up and smiles at you and gives you more water and shyly looks away, that was the serious criminal they went after. There was a woman who was caught up in those raids, as well as many innocent people. I'll tell you about this woman in a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about the behavior of these people that we just now empowered. They broke down the door to some permanent U.S. residents, elderly and sickly. They were babysitting their United States citizen grandchild. They busted down the door at gunpoint, scaring them half to death. Rifled through the woman's purse. It was Christmas time. She had $160 that she was going to go use to shop. They grabbed her purse, rifled through it, and took the $160 as evidence. That child was extremely frightened. Took her weeks and weeks and weeks to have a decent night's sleep. An innocent vendor that again happened to be that rascally wrong color again was driving in his pickup truck to deliver some goods to a warehouse during the same day of the raids. And they saw him there. They pointed assault rifles at him, dragged him out of the truck, slammed him up against the truck, threw him on the floor. And when he was protesting in English, hey, what's going on? What did I do? He had absolutely no clue what's going on. What, you speak English? Yeah, and what am I doing here? What's going on? I'm just delivering something to these folks. Oh, we thought that you were, one of these illegals. Hey, sorry, dude. I'm sorry, man. Laughing and patting themselves on the back. Can you imagine what we just did? One of those agents walking into the Acambado warehouse, grabbing the Acambado apron, putting on a sombrero, and dancing like a fool. We got Acambado, mocking those individuals whose lives had been irrevocably changed, sitting there watching them in utter shock, and dancing around, we got Acambado, we got Acambado, ha, 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 pointing at them and saying, we started with Acambado, and rest assured that we're not going to rest until we target every Hispanic-owned business and rid Northwest Arkansas of illegal aliens. That's exactly what they said. That's what we've empowered our people to do with 287G. It's a very short period of time since it's been enacted. And in that short period, I'm giving you a brief overview. Time doesn't permit me to go into details after details and stories after stories, documented tales of what has occurred, the abuses that have occurred because we empowered these individuals. Is that what we want to create in Arkansas? That's a very serious question. A woman named Selene really illustrates the deep, deep, deep hypocrisy in this debate and that surrounds this issue. There's a woman who was caught up in the Acambado raids who possessed a false identification. Dean, if any of your students have one of those pesky little false IDs, I'd advise them to get rid of them quick. Because even though they let them into bars, tell them to leave them at home and not to come to Northwest Arkansas. Because in Northwest Arkansas, they could face 10 to 15 years in prison for possessing one of these false IDs. And that's exactly what this mother, I met her at Mother's Day at a church service, and I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever had a Mother's Day like that. My mother's in good health. The mother of my children is a wonderful mom, and we usually celebrate that moment. But I spent that day with a deep, deep sadness. I had to look at this woman and her own mother standing there with tears rolling down her eyes, telling me that she didn't know what she was going to do. The United States citizen's child whose hand she was holding, and the immigrant child whose other hand she was holding, that didn't understand the implications of their respective status and what that meant for them. And as she told me that she was facing 10 to 15 years and didn't know what she did, I thought immediately about another individual whose justice looks altogether different. You might have heard of this bizarre tale that occurred in Northwest Arkansas in a little growing city called Centerton. A mayor known as Ken Williams, otherwise known as Don LaRose, a Baptist preacher who wanted to escape his lackluster life in a Midwest town. So he decided to leave his family to fend for themselves. He was a deadbeat. Left his wife under the most bizarre of circumstances, claiming that he was kidnapped by Satanists and brainwashed. Now, if there is any more extreme tale than that, I haven't heard one. It's wild. But this really illustrates a hypocrisy and the true motivation behind certain individuals. Because what of Don's LaRose, a.k.a. Kim Williams' justice? What did it look like? I'll tell you what it looked like. Local law enforcement officials described him as a good man who had made a few mistakes. And his reward? Oh, he had a reward, all right. He was hired by the radio station who has made it its role to demonize undocumented immigrants for identity theft and those kind of crimes. Ken Williams had stolen the identity of a deceased acquaintance, and he had been fraudulently receiving governmental benefits with that identity. But what's he facing? Pat on the back, oh, he's going to be all right. Mr. Mayor, and a nice fat job for you here at this local radio station, because you're the kind of people we want on the airwaves. Folks, this is what is the reality that surrounds this debate. I can go on and on and on and on, but I want to leave some time for questions. I really appreciate this opportunity to address the school, and thank you so much for your attention. I hope that I've added a little bit to you, and I'm going to be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Jim. Questions? Dennis?
In thinking about the town in Northwest Arkansas and the town in Pennsylvania that changed their laws, think about the United States moving through the global world at the moment and how this administration has changed it pretty much in the same direction. And how you could have stood up there and said, I'm also human. This local problem we're having is representation of where we're moving globally. And you coming from a different area, generational-wise, make a comment, if you would, please, in relationship, how we can take this and learn how we need to move globally and re-embrace our humanity with everybody.
It's a great question. I was at a restaurant a few weeks ago. I was having lunch with a friend of mine, and I saw three elderly ladies out for their lunch, their afternoon lunch, and I saw my own mother there in the crowd. Not really, but I could see my own mother doing much of the same thing in the face of these elderly women. And they were talking amongst themselves, and I was waiting, and I could overhear their conversation, and one of them said, things are changing so much here in Arkansas. And the other one piped up before you could even blink, yes, and I just hate it. People don't like change for the most part. People are resistant to change. But what we have to demonstrate is that change can be good. I would have loved to have joined that conversation with those elderly ladies and told them that my generation had a deep respect for what they had accomplished in their generation, and that we wanted to take the best of what they had to offer and build upon it and continue this process forward, and that they didn't have to fear this change because we had all the best intentions. Schools like this, education is really the key. We have to have those community forums. We have to have those discussions. Those studies by the Winthrop Rockefeller that really loaned us great insight as to what the dynamics really were for immigrants. This new study that they're currently conducting on the impact of raids on children, and other studies that will be forthcoming. We have to have those town hall meetings and those groups and have these discussions and talk to those people and engage those people who disagree so that they can see that there's a really human face to this. Hope that answered your question.
Yes. I'll go over here and then I'll get to
Hi. I've been blessed to work with child immigrants through education and advocate for their families. And it is a human rights issue. And I do believe that the rule of law should be governed by the law of humanity. Sure. And so I also believe, though, that Americans are good people for the most part. But what I've seen is that their objections are being driven through fear, from misinformation and misknowledge. So I really just wanted to applaud you for putting a face on this issue, because I do believe Americans are good people, and that once they see the truth and they see that they don't detach themselves from the issue, that this is a child, that this is a human being who's being affected by this. So I just want to applaud you and thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Jim, in Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, he commented that he was concerned during the civil rights era of that time about the failure of the church, the religious community, to address the issue of racial integration. Has the religious community been forthright, outspoken, engaged in this new civil rights issue? And if not, what would you ask of that community?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. for that. To this point, this issue has been met with mainly silence from the religious community. There have been those in the religious community, such as Catholic Charities and Methodist Association, groups like the Arkansas Coalition, Friendship Coalition, that join together ministers with business interests and things like that. And so there are some groups now, but by and large, that's been one of my complaints in this whole issue, is when is the church going to stand up and put a human face on this issue? This is a human rights issue. This is a civil rights issue. If you look at the scriptures that are purported to be held in such high esteem in Northwest Arkansas corners, the scriptures are clear about how to treat the least of these that are among us. Scriptures say, whatever you've done unto the least of these, you've done them unto me. And talks about our responsibilities to that immigrant that finds itself in your lands as a foreigner, and what our obligations are to them. So I think that there's a lot more opportunity for the church to become engaged in this issue, and I think it is the key aspect that's really going to change us when this is turned back in to a moral issue, and it's snatched from the hands of those extreme fundamentalist groups who love to throw out the quote, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and the things that are God's to God, twisting things out of context and those kinds of things. And when we snatch that argument back and we remind our neighbors that for the neighbor, you have always been decent. When have I ever known you to be indecent? We can't lose our sense of decency when it comes to these immigrants. They are living, breathing, real human beings. And I think the church is going to have to take up that message.
Right here, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Miranda, for being here today. Would you have experience about what happens to the children of those deported in the raids that have occurred here in the state of Arkansas, in Arkadelphia, in Northwest Arkansas, the circumstances, how the children learn that their parents have been deported and what becomes of them?
Yes, that's one of the more troubling aspects of this issue. As to specifics that have occurred here in Northwest Arkansas, I don't necessarily have some of those other than some of what I've been involved with. But as a whole, some of these children are taken to holding facilities where they are kept in a jail, type setting, and held there for long, extended periods of time. Other children are forced to stay with relatives or go into the foster care system and lose contact with their parents, or along with their parents, are dropped off, sometimes in the middle of nowhere with no way to fend for themselves, in the middle of what really is a foreign land to them. And so it's very troubling. Maybe, Paul, I think you might have had something to add to this.
Go
Okay.
ahead, take the mic, go ahead and do it.
That has been my experience as well. I mean, occasionally they'll let the mothers go for humanitarian reasons and release them.
Paul, introduce yourself so they know who you are.
I'm Paul Charton with the Catlett Law Firm. I'm an immigration attorney here in town, and they will occasionally, for humanitarian reasons, let the mothers go pending the deportation charge. I mean, they don't waive the deportation proceedings. They'll just sometimes let them go pending sending them back to Mexico. And obviously the families get torn asunder because you have the Hobbesian choice of leaving a child behind with other relatives, or to somehow fend for themselves while the parents go back to their home country. It can't be any harder of a decision than that, to have to allow the kids to grow up without their parents for the benefit of living in the United States.
If I may, you're addressing a situation where there is some communication allowed between parent and child. I have heard reports where parents are simply deported, no phone calls allowed, no arrangements made for children who are being cared, thinking the parents were at work.
Yeah.
At
That
any
is true.
shift.
And that's I've heard those anecdotally as well. Unfortunately, and we've ICE has a tendency to, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the immigration police, effectively, they have a tendency to hold people somewhat incommunicado. So once they detain someone, you lose track of them pretty quickly, and you can't, even if the children were old enough to track their parents down or know their parents' cell phone number, they're not necessarily going to be able to find their parents, and immigration enforcement isn't going to necessarily, take the steps to let the parents communicate with their children. They're held incommunicado largely.
You have a question? You had,
I did. Jim, thank you so much. I really appreciate this, and I think that folks around here needed to hear what you had to say.
Thank you.
And I wanted to seek your comment on one thing. When the woman's name escapes me, the woman who was forgotten about for days in the courthouse, when I was reading stories about that tragic and deplorable situation, some of the commenters were on the news article, when you read it online, you can see the electronic comments. They were saying, well, she really brought this on herself. It has nothing to do with her being a Hispanic. It has, they weren't racially profiling her. It was just one of those things. She broke the law, and it's unfortunate, but it had nothing to do with her immigration status. You and I both know that that's certainly not the case. She would have been able to bond out probably with a $500 bond had there not been an immigration hold placed on her.
Sure.
And in that case, she wouldn't have been in jail.
Right.
I mean, it's probably a misdemeanor offense, which my understanding, they dropped the charges earlier this week because she had an alibi.
Yeah.
So is that correct? Yeah, they finally dropped the charges. So I wanted to know from your perspective and being familiar with what's going on up there, if that's sinking in, that this tragedy did indeed occur because of her immigration status and the fact that she was Hispanic. And if she weren't Hispanic and she were selling pirated DVDs, they would have
Right.
probably never called immigration to
Right.
find out. I mean, if I didn't have a driver's license on me, they're not going to call immigration because I don't have my driver's license,
Right.
whereas they might if they pulled you over.
That's correct. Paul, you bring up some good points there. I think that the people of Northwest Arkansas have been largely resistant to what's been staring them in the face. These are some pretty big questions that they're having to be faced with, and many of them want to skirt them. I had those troubling conversations with law enforcement officials. I met with the head of Washington County law enforcement, and we had that tough discussion. And as you said, his comments were that this was not racially motivated, and this had nothing to do with her status, and that this was simply a very unfortunate mistake. But ironically, after I shared with him the perception of the Hispanic community, which is a significant percentage of the population, our concerns largely went unheeded in that he rehired that bailiff. He was reinstated in the exact same post where he had committed this mistake. And in fact, the judge that had been away to Little Rock, refiling for his election, and who played a small part, howbeit, not a direct part, but certainly the fact that he wasn't there played a part, he requested him back. And what I asked of the law enforcement official is simply this. We had a prominent citizen who had been in the news, and I'm sure you would recognize his name if I mentioned his name, but he's an ex-Walmart executive who was caught up in some thievery, so to speak. And I asked the question, do you suppose that this gentleman would have been forgotten in that holding cell? And again, I was met with silence. But the truth is, from my perspective, is that when you create a climate in which human beings are systematically dehumanized, and they become less and less and less and less important, and as a matter of fact, they become a scourge, you are creating a climate in which it is not a stretch to see how a human being could be forgotten and left in a holding cell to fend for themselves. Now, folks, this was grotesque. This woman was forced to drink her own urine and sleep in her own feces. And we don't like to hear that. We don't want to hear that because it sounds ugly. But this is what's happening. And again, in a very short period of time, this has really escalated. Now, what does that tell you if in a very short period of time, all this has risen quite to the surface? It was bubbling just underneath the surface. And it was when they found their pretext that it all came rushing out. And we can affect that change. We can take this back and say no to these kinds of things. But it's going to take each and every one of us to stand up with our Latino brothers and sisters and our organizations like the ACLU and Arkansas Friendship Coalition and say, we stand behind you and we support you.
Got one question, Annie, right here. Final question.
First, I want to welcome you to the honorable role of being an activist. History will reward you for being an activist. One of the things that I wanted to ask you to think ahead. I've been in sundown towns. A sundown town is that I need to be out of town by the time the sun went down because of my race. It doesn't matter whether it was an American Indian that had to get out of town or whether it was an African American or whether it's a Hispanic. The problem that I want you to address is, does it happen first where education is low? I know Arkansas, and I almost know the answer to my question of where it happens first. Is it the lack of education that also becomes the lack of power? And if that is true, and we've seen it happen in this country with the Native American, the Indian, we've seen it happen with Africans, we've seen it happen with the Hispanic from South America. As we move into this global world, where do we see the next group if it's not us that's in control and they begin to come to America as they did in the Holocaust? What group, other than the Indian, the African, the Mexican, which group will be the next that will be oppressed in Arkansas if education makes a difference or if money makes the difference?
Okay, all right.
It's a very interesting question. There is no doubt that education plays a key role in how people react to this contentious issue, because this issue is often very emotional and it's highly speculative, and there's a lot of emotion invested in this. There are perceptions such as, we feel, or we believe, or we think, and there's a lot of that that's floating around, but it isn't until you get deeper into the facts and you start educating yourselves. And it goes back to letting people understand and teaching our children that those perceived differences, they don't run as deep as we think they run. They're really shallow and quite on the surface. And when people start seeing their brother, their neighbor, those that they may have not considered to be a neighbor, as is illustrated in the beautiful parable in the scriptures of the Good Samaritan, somebody who was not the classic neighbor ended up being the neighbor. So when people start to take a look at their world around them in that context, they can start to see that these things that they perceive as deep and problematic are not quite as problematic as they perceive. But as far as your question as to who will be the next group, it's a good question. Who knows who the next group will be? I mean, there's certainly a lot of groups that could fill that role. We have groups right now in the United States. The gay and lesbian community is facing a tremendous amount of discrimination, and a lot of there's a lot of consternation that surrounds their issues, and we have to be understanding of that group. But one of the things that we can also bring up those communities that are in fact very diverse. If you look at communities that have high diversity, lots of different cultures, lots of different people, lots of different types of people, those communities, there have been studies that are found that those communities are quite prosperous. And we have to tell that message over and over.
Jim Miranda, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.